Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Annemarie Schimmel lecture. And this is, of course, the first public program that we have had since we reopened the galleries for the art of the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia, this week, in fact. So we're delighted to see you here. And we're also particularly delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, James L. Wescoat, Jr., who is the Aga Khan Professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has a PhD in geography from the University of Chicago. And previously, he served as head of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He conducts research on water systems in South Asia and the United States and has special expertise on the waterworks of Mughal gardens in Lahore, Pakistan, and Agra, India. His publications include co-edited volumes such as Mughal Gardens, Sources, Places, Representations, Prospects, The Mughal Garden, Interpretation, Conservation, Implications, Shalimar Garden, Landscape, Form and Meaning, and Political Economies of Landscape Change. He has contributed to chapters on waterworks and landscape design at the Mahtab Bagh in the Moonlight Garden, New Discoveries at the Taj Mahal. It's also enticing. It just makes me wish we could all be transported right here, but I think we will be anyway tonight. And he's also written essays on garden waterworks of Nagaur, Rajasthan. Jim has served as an advisor on conservation projects at the Taj Mahal complex. I mean, you can't get better than that. Nagaur Fort Complex and Champaner Pavagad World Heritage Site, and other landscape conservation projects involving waterworks and gardens in South Asia. At the river basin scale, he has contributed to studies of water, climate, and food security in South Asia and North America, and is the co-author of Water for Life, Water Management and Environmental Policy with geographer Gilbert F. White. And so tonight he is going to speak to us about landscapes of Sufi space in Mughal Delhi and Lahore. And with no further ado, please help me, join me in welcoming Professor Wescoat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Camby, and thanks to you and to Dr. Hyder and others in the Metropolitan Museum for inviting me. It's a great privilege on many levels, and wonderful that you mentioned the Mehtab Bagh and Nagaur projects. Having Liz Moynihan here, who led those projects, is also a special and personal pleasure for me. And I really feel that this opportunity to speak on the occasion of the opening of the new, recently after the openings of the new galleries on the arts of the Arab lands in Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia, is really a privilege. And as a geographer, I find this name just wonderful, because each word evokes a sense of place as well as culture and their arts. And so also on a personal level, I'll say as a child growing up in New Jersey, my mother used to bring me to the Metropolitan as a very young child, and we visited all of the galleries, every one of them, many times, and it was my first and most vivid experience of the arts. And so a half century ago, I could never have imagined then that I'd have a chance to speak here now. Some years later then, when I had a chance to first hear Professor Annemarie Schimmel speak at a conference that was organized on Fatehpur Sikri in India by Michael Brand and Glenn Lowry in 1985 or so. This was a conference in which all of the talks were really illuminating, and hers also seemed illuminated. She would close her eyes and speak really from memory, sometimes having cards of Persian and Arabic poetry, just in case, she said, just in case I might forget a line. But you never saw that she did. Her eyes were closed and she would speak. And on this occasion, I seem to recall that she concluded with a verse of her own. And it was just transfixing as a presentation on that place. And when preparing for the talk this evening, I reread Annemarie's book on Deciphering the Signs of God, a phenomenological approach to Islam, in which she was moving from an emphasis on Sufi poetry towards aspects of Sufi culture that were closely related to what she called mainstream Islam. And she included sections in the early chapters of that book on nature, on space, on number, and on paradise, all of which converge in certain ideas about, such as the idea of the Hashbehisht, or 8 paradises, which is one of the spatial patterns of Indo-Islamic garden design, which will turn out to be significant in the talk this evening. Another of her later books, I think it was perhaps her last book, on the empire of the great Mughals, History, Art, and Culture. It's published in 2000 in German, but translated posthumously in 2004 in English. Was also marked something of a shift from Sufi poetics that I found intriguing, because this last volume was looking at Mughal culture and a kind of a worldly dynasty, as well as its spiritual dimensions. But she wrote in the preface, I think, something that was indicative in that volume, which was that she would sometimes, when walking on the street, see a person that she thought whose curl of hair reminded her of a portrait of Jahangir or of Jahanara. And so she was able to see these aspects of the Mughal and Sufi world in the contemporary experience all around her and communicate that very effectively with all of us. There was a short factual passage in the Empire of the Great Mughals that provides really a good starting point for the talk this evening, where she wrote that in 1652, in the reign of Shah Jahan, the governor of Delhi had Nizamuddin Aulia's a small mausoleum on the left, which is the spiritual center of Delhi, remodeled into its present form with white marble and a beautifully vaulted cupola. There are many references, still quoting from her, many references to the construction of mausoleums for holy men and the remodeling of existing structures during this period, among them Mian Mir's small, elegant burial place in Lahore on the right. These 2 shrines will be something that provides something of a counterpoint, and in this essay that she was writing as part of the Empire of the Mughal Gardens, that will form the starting point of our talk this evening. That's going to examine the evolving relationships between Mughal and Sufi funerary landscapes in both Delhi and Lahore primarily. It will include some other places as well. And we'll include some of the imagery of the saints who were buried in those shrines. This image on the left, painting sometimes said by some to be a representation of Nizamuddin and his principal poet, murid, disciple, Amir Khusro, and the image on the right, which is a near contemporary painting of Khwaja Mian Mir, his disciple Mullah Shah Badakshi, and the Mughal prince Dara Shikoh. What I'd like to do this evening is to try to develop a landscape perspective on the spaces of Sufi culture and the ways in which Mughal rulers and builders tried to connect them through the built environment as well as call it a cultural space. And looking at these 2 images, you might say or ask, what landscape? It's kind of not very distinct or detailed as part, or it wouldn't appear to be so. But if the landscape in a kind of everyday sense is not immediately evident, space is very important in these images, and we'll come back to them. But let's look at two additional images with much more explicit representations of landscape that might be familiar to us. Again, Dara Shikoh on the left with sages set within a garden. And on the right, a painting of from Sadi's collected works, both of the Mughal period, these paintings. And that right-hand image is one of my favorite for among kind of allegorical images for including city, enclosed garden, fields surrounding them, pastoral landscapes, mountains, forest, and a riverfront spiritual landscape of many different forms, from ablution to discourse and prayer. With the image, very kind of important image of the ways in which water would sometimes issue from a place or a seat or throne. In thinking about landscape research and landscape inquiry and the different varieties and forms it can take, I think it's useful to mention a little bit about what one means here. And some of the familiar or established patterns of landscape inquiry will include this first idea of landscape as valued scenery. It's very prevalent in Anglo-American research. It's associated with the picturesque tradition of art history, art and architectural history. These images are from the Taj Mahal area, with the exception of the bottom one. This second image meant to represent a tradition more of the French landscape research, research on paysage, of life world, of everyday life and experience of work and labor and livelihoods from the ground level, whereas the picturesque is frequently a bird's eye type of view. Landscape in a kind of cartographic sense of the term is represented here with this Iconos satellite imagery, image of the Taj Mahal complex. And it was very prevalent in German and Soviet geography as a form of landscape science, in which mapping and understanding the structure of natural and social processes geographically was of central concern. And this was part of a slide that I used when presenting these different types of landscape research to the Archaeological Survey of India, which was considering some questions about how one should go about the process of landscape heritage conservation. And we asked toward the end of the talk, well, what would be the landscape approach for this Indo-Islamic heritage? What would be the landscape conservation or the modes of landscape inquiry most relevant to this heritage that was in a focused concern for the ASI and India, Pakistan, Bangladesh today? And so we'll try to have a response to that question by the end of the talk. I'd like to start where the dynasty starts, and we'll be able to trace the Mughal rulers, the early originator of the dynasty, Babur, from his youth in the Fergana Valley to the Timurid heartland. And just as an early point of correction, the Mughals didn't refer to themselves as such. They regarded themselves as Timurids, of descendants of Timur, who ruled primarily from the Samarkand area and with kind of influence and really from Delhi all the way to Damascus. And Samarkand was the center of that world in the 15th century. A century later, Babur, as a young prince, is coming to try to compete with rivals and with Uzbek rivals as well, rival Timurid groups as well as others for control of Samarkand, which he was not able to establish in a sustained way, and moved down into Kabul, where he was successful in establishing a base. Moved from there, visiting his relations, Timurid relations, who were established in Herat and had established an extraordinary culture set within gardens, but a very high culture that impressed him enormously, and which he emulated in part, but in other parts sought to distinguish himself before realizing that the prospects for larger scale growth and expansion were limited in the north and west for him, and that he would move in a series of invasions across the Punjab plains towards the Sultanate center and headquarters in the Delhi-Agra corridor in northern India. As he's doing that, he's moving from a Timurid cultural context, which had very strong Sufi relations with the Naqshbandi order of Sufis in Central Asia, which had a very strong political role, very strong set of really authority and power, large land holdings, political engagement, as well as spiritual advice and direction with the rulers of that region. And as he's moving out of that area, he's going to experience new forms of Sufi orders and develop new relationships. And it's worth asking also, well, what is Sufism? I don't know. This may be kind of taken for granted, but I don't think so, because when reading Annemarie Schimmel's, rereading her chapter on Mystical Dimensions of Islam, the first chapter is What is Sufism? It's a very long chapter. Many answers, many partial answers, but let me offer a couple of key points that may be useful. One is that she stressed that in its formative period, Sufism was a mode in which there was a real interiorization of Islam and interior experience of the principles of Islam, and where she was, which she tried to summarize as being a personal experience of the central mystery of the religion, and that of Tawheed, the declaration of the oneness of God. Through the centuries, that between that really half millennium before the Timurids, that Sufism was developing, many orders, Sufi orders developed, following different spiritual guides and chains of spiritual guides, whose personal teachings, whose examples in life, whose blessings and guidance would take precedence over some of the specific schools of Islamic law and philosophy and reason, but never over the foundations of Islam in the Quran and the Sunnah, or examples in life and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. Schimmel then provided the second key point, I think, for our purposes, which was that the full impact of Islam is established in northern India, in the South Asia that Babur would arrive at in the 12th and 13th centuries, 2-3 centuries before he's arriving there, with the establishment, particularly of the Chishti Sufi order, and the leader, the early peer of that brotherhood, Sheikh Muinuddin Chishti, in settling ultimately and presently in the city of Ajmer, but with other centers in Delhi and Pakistan. As Babur is moving then across and towards this environment, this new environment, he's moving through Lahore, where we'll spend some time. And so let's take a moment to stop at one of the key early Sultanate period Sufi shrines of Data Ganjbakhsh al-Hijwiri, who was one of the authors of a very early Sufi treatise. And he's based in Lahore. It's modern architecture, but what you can see in the excavations is a construction site, and what it reveals for us is the old river terrace on which the shrine was situated in Lahore. And so that soil delineation is a mark, and the river terraces proved to be extremely important, both for the location of shrines and also of subsequently of Mughal gardens. Muinuddin Chishti actually came and on a spiritual visit to the shrine of Data Ganj Bakhsh, and the site of his prayers, his extended and secluded prayers in what's called a chilla, is marked by this plaque even today at that shrine from the 13th century. If we look and map out the location of the shrine relative to the citadel during this pre-Mughal period, and the limits of the city and the way that graveyards would be established kind of on the outer limits, but other shrines, each one of these black dots being primarily either a Sufi mazar or the squares, other historical sites, we get a sense of the structure of Mughal capital cities, Lahore, Delhi, Agra, along a major river and its terrace. And in this case, this I think is a good moment for me to mention that my first involvement with the relationship between the Mughals and Sufi saints came through research at in Lahore on Mughal gardens and their history, in which we were, and we had really generous support from the Smithsonian Institution, the Freer and Sackler Galleries of Art, and what we found as we were doing field research on this topic was that some of the most extant historical sites that were named and dated and had stories were Sufi shrines. Very small ones, some of them just a grave, but frequently local people would know the story and have some dating and text supported that. So in the full survey, there's several hundred of them. And what that enabled was something of a historical geography at a finer grain than is often possible, and it enabled us to kind of sort initially for this Sultanate pre-Mughal period what the sites were. And we'll go through and see how the city's whole geography is changing and how saints' tombs and Mughal projects help to shape those changes as we kind of proceed. Babur continues. There's no evidence, unfortunately, that he actually visited Data Sab's tomb in Lahore, but he did when he first was victorious over the Lodi sultans in the city of Panipat, just outside of Delhi, and arrived at Delhi. The very first place that he visited was that of the shrine of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, which is located in this green box here. The river Yamuna is flowing downstream. The historical capitals, Delhi is a city of many capitals from the pre-Mughal period, and those of that period were primarily located along the ridge to the south, Tughlaqabad, Siri, Jahanpana, and Lalkot, all in this kind of southern belt of the ridge where it was possible to strategically and also for water control purposes to be in a well-provisioned and strategic location. Interestingly, some of the later, mainly later post Nizamuddin and later Mughal capitals locate to the north, including the old Delhi that we know today, which was the New Delhi of Mughal times, Shah Jahanabad, to the north here. New Delhi I haven't located here. But what we see is that Nizamuddin's initial shrine, located initially to be at some distance from the capitals, he didn't want to be cumbered by the demands and of courtly life and or any of its trappings. And so he located along the riverfront, but then also on what proved to be a very important road. And that location was not only important, but during his lifetime, but when he died, and subsequently as others located near his shrine, and many sought to be buried in proximity to him, all the way up through the 18th end of the 18th century, this green belt within Delhi becomes something of a funerary belt, of the graves from Sultanate and Mughal and late Mughal periods between the two major capital centers of Delhi. So it helps us to kind of get a spatial sense of the relationship between this Sufi landscape and what we'll see in Humayun's tomb was affiliated with it as a Mughal funerary center in relationship to the larger urban context. The shrine of Nizamuddin Aulia on the right, a place of extraordinary living heritage today and of pilgrimage for people from really all over the world, as well as the region of South Asia. Not immediately evident from one's experience today as to how it was associated with the Yamuna River, and its shallow groundwater is actually closer to the shrine in a step well that's been conserved recently by the ASI and Aga Khan Trust for Culture. But it brings to mind some interesting kind of questions we might ask about what was what was Nizamuddin's views on landscape and space himself during his own lifetime. And there is a collection of sayings of Mulfazat that has come down, which proved to be enormously useful because from his standpoint, really the garden and the landscape were not of special interest, and that's perhaps even understating the issue. Let me read one passage from his that one of his disciples recorded during his lifetime. Nizamuddin was gifted 2 gardens, but instead of being grateful, he rejected the gift, stating, and I quote, "What have I to do with gardens and fields and land?" And smiling, he added, "If I were to accept that gift, people might say of me, the sheikh wants to stroll in his garden and strut about in his fields and his land. What kind of work would I be doing? What sort of environment would that be for me?" And then he became somewhat teary-eyed and recollected. He said, "None of our forefathers and none of our spiritual masters in the Chishti lineage has engaged in such activity." Landholding being a form of worldliness, and while Nizamuddin was engaged with the world and of providing relief and sustenance for so many disciples and people in need who were coming through to the city in poverty. But this was a distinction that he made. Now, although he made this distinction, one of his principal poet disciples that I mentioned, Amir Khusro, and later Mughal admirers made up for his silence and disinterest with abundant worldly imagery of gardens associated with Nizamuddin and his paradise gardens. He made no reference, for example, to charbags and Hashbahisht and paradise garden. Even paradise is very limited in the Nizamuddin's writings and really hagiography. But subsequent writings by Amir Khusro, and there's wonderful illustrated manuscripts of one of them, the Hashbahisht, or 8 Paradises of Amir Khusro, which was done in emulation of Nizami's great Hafpikar manuscript, depicted. This is really from the Metropolitan's collection. You've no doubt seen it upstairs recently and enjoyed it immensely. But this masterpiece and kind of emulation of Nizami then was picked up again in the Mughal period and represented in landscape and garden terms. And with the association of this concept of the Hashbahisht, which we'll see has special spatial significance in Mughal times and for the design of Humayun's tomb garden. Well, Babur continued in a whole series of battles that culminated in the conquest of Agra, establishment of a capital there, but he died soon after. And he was succeeded by his son Humayun, depicted on the right in this portrait. And it's a wonderful portrait because if you look kind of closely at it, Humayun was very mystically inclined, but politically incompetent. That's an understatement. He was less than incompetent. Maybe that's an overstatement. He did win back the empire ultimately with a lot of help. But in this painting, you see this main trunk of the tree of the Mughal dynasty cut off, and this second branch coming up. And I've always thought that that branch is some symbol of Humayun himself as a lesser branch of a main trunk, but nonetheless the source of continuity for the dynasty in this much later portrait of him. He had an extraordinary passion for mysticism, for the symbolism of numbers and of days of the week and colors and astrological types of symbolism as well. But after being driven out of India and into exile in Persia, he finally reconquers the empire in 1556, only to fall down the same year, fall down a set of stairs and die, and leaving his very young son, Akbar, to succeed him as the ruler of the Mughal period, now Mughal dynasty. And Akbar, as part of Humayun's project, he had started the capital of Dinpanah, shown on this map here, up to the north. And this is a map from Glenn Lowry's work. And the main gate today on the western side of this fortress of Purana Kila, and the place where it's believed that he fell from the stairs and died, called the Sher Mandal. Ultimately, he's re-entombed here in Humayun's tomb to the south of Dinpanah. Some years later, in the tomb garden complex that was built by his son Akbar and stepmother Haji Begum, Akbar's stepmother, Humayun's wife Haji Begum, who had really a joint role in the establishment of this tomb garden. I have a separate paper that really looks at the whole design of the tomb complex with Mughal units of measurements and modules and the whole kind of from the very smallest detail up to the plan of the tomb and the layout of the garden. An extraordinary logic, a spatial logic that operated there. But just for tonight, since that's a separate paper for tonight's presentation, I want to mention a couple of larger points about this tomb complex. Number one, it was laid out jointly as a charbagh garden divided into 4 quadrants, but also as a hashbahish, equally 9 equal quadrants. And it's unusual in that respect in being both hashbahish and charbagh joint in one design. So really quite very elegant. Then when we kind of look at it in plan view, you can see this initial kind of clear layout of the charbagh in 4, but then each of these subsidiary constitute the 9 or 8 squares around a central square of the tomb, which makes 9, which constitute the hashbahished form. The tomb itself has a hashbahished form. Many of the decorative details also hashbahished in form. So unbelievable scaling in the design of this place. And then a whole series of surroundings, these tombs to the north, the Sundar Nursery, which is now also undergoing some conservation design and transformation into an arboretum. The Nizamuddin Basti to the west is the location of where the shrine and Durga of Nizamuddin are located. Today, because a road runs through it, a major highway runs through it, the relationship between the Mughal tomb and the Sufi shrine and settlement are not as clear as they would have been historically. And so that's what I'd like to really focus on a little bit in the next few moments and say, well, it's always been known that Humayun's tomb was located close to Nizamuddin and that it was monumental. These were two key transformations in Mughal architecture and landscape architecture. But the question of, well, why precisely here and why this particular size has been less kind of clear. And so in looking at this, there are a number of hypotheses that we kind of were testing out. And one was that actually it was the location of the riverfront terrace, which ran, and there's even within the garden a terraced set of quadrants below the main level of the garden along what would have been a floodplain terrace here. And one of the few truly north-south alignments of the Yamuna River in this area of the city. It cuts northwest to the north of the tomb, and it cuts southeast when it's near the Nizamuddin railroad station. So this is perhaps, just in physiographic terms, a good location for a garden of this side that wanted to be on the riverfront. There'll be another, though, dimension that's very interesting, which is a very small place in the northeast corner just outside the wall, which is known as the Khanqa and Chilla place of Nizamuddin. And today you can visit this place, very small, modest complex with a mosque and a small graveyard and an attendant who's here, who will kind of greet you and offer all of these stories about the kind of the miracles that have happened in this location and some of its history. His prayer place is actually within the wall of Humayun's tomb garden, and if you look through the gateway, you're looking into the garden, Humayun's tomb garden. So these two spaces were very closely related to one another spatially. And if we look at the location of the mosque and that small courtyard and the small area where this attendant resides, and some of the associated rooms that he mentions with respect to some of the miracle stories that he'll share with you, there's an interesting kind of observation that we made when looking at this, in that whereas when he was offering his prayers, it was within the wall and heading largely to the west, and the Qibla orientation towards Mecca, and this part of Delhi is roughly 267 degrees, but this mosque is oriented at an angle here. And so one starts to look at that and kind of project from the northeast corner of the garden across to, and it seems to head towards or be oriented towards the shrine of Nizamuddin. And if you were trying to make a connection visually today, you wouldn't be able to. In historical times, you might get close with some of these historical photos that still are available that remind, this is from an upper terrace of Humayun's tomb itself, and looking slightly southwestward towards the shrine area of Nizamuddin. And outside of the gate, the main gate to Humayun's tomb, you can see in what's now a very grassy area that it was truly a graveyard complex. Afsarwala's mosque is here. Behind them is Isa Khan's octagonal tomb from the Shah period, and behind that and across the way is going to be where the shrine of Nizamuddin Aulia is located. If you were to travel there today, the first thing you'd have to do is cut across traffic. Run and try not to be hit as you go just to the south of the Subsburj tomb in a roundabout here that's swirling around, and those who've been in Delhi know how fast this is. There is an underpass here, but if you're cutting across towards the shrine, you'd be here, and then all of a sudden go transformatively into a covered passage where many of the types of devotional offerings are available for purchase, and shoes would be stored before one enters into the shrine complex and first sees by this path that I've taken on this occasion the grave of Emir Khusro, and then turning to the right one would visit directly the shrine of Nizamuddin Aulia as renovated by the Mughals and others. Qawwali music that Emir Khusro was influential on. It was practiced every Thursday night, as well as other special occasions, even currently. And when you're in the shrine complex, also one finds it difficult to kind of imagine or project backwards to the riverfront location that Nizamuddin sought for this chilla or secluded prayer and private place of meditation and instruction for his disciples along the riverfront. What's really striking is that as one starts to think in both directions, from chilla to shrine and back again, one can start to project and replicate the space of the garden and see a more formal relationship, spatial relationship, cut across, and the intersection of these is at the main gateways to the complex and to the sarai to the south. Let's focus in on that. This is that gateway at the intersection. To the south, the Arabki Sarai, which was the main caravanserai that served those who would be visiting this area of Delhi. To the north, that fortress, urban capital and fortress of Purana Kila. Just to get the imagery of this space, that main gateway, if we're looking north through, it would be along this axis. It's really the intersection of two gates today. You'll know them if you visited the place. Looking northward through this gate is looking northward in this direction on this photograph. If you proceed through Sundar Nursery along that alignment, you'll go along a historical path, and ultimately, if you were able to leap over the wall into the Delhi Zoo, you would arrive at a coast minar, a mile marker in the zoo. And if we map these out, you start to see that this complex, where the Humayun's tomb garden is related to the shrine, is also part of a larger urban geography. Tombs, sarai, coast minar, one path leading to the Purana Kila, another directly on alignment with the main gate. And one can start to also reconstruct how this complex, Mughal-Sufi complex, might have been before the design of Humayun's tomb and the orange paths here, several different paths that may have existed. But once the tomb was constructed, the Barapula Bridge across this stream, leading through Nizamuddin East, very prominent neighborhood to this day, passing, one would pass to the west into the caravanserai that we mentioned, and if proceeding northward towards Lahore and Kabul, one would move in this direction, passing this capital, and then Shah Jahanabad northwestward towards Lahore. So an amazing level of geographies, and we find that same kind of set of relationships of movement and spatial organization in so many of the projects that the Mughals undertook. And briefly, I'll mention Akbar's close association with the pilgrimage center of Muinuddin Chishti in Ajmer, and he's here in this Akbarnama image on pilgrimage to that site. There were Mughal period maps that marked out how, from stage to stage, one would move and travel, and the Sufis moved for learning and for devotion, while the Mughals were moving for both conquest but also for the experience of different places. This Mughal map on the right is cumulatively assembling for the kind of the Indus Basin, the main Indus main stem here and its tributaries, with Delhi to the southeast here, moving up to Lahore, across to Kabul. An extraordinary spatial organization which was really kind of thought of in integrative terms, from architectural to geographical scales. Again, an image of Akbar at Ajmer. this time in the shrine itself, offering his prayers at the graveside of Muinuddin Chishti. And his projects in Ajmer were both of an urban scale and an incremental scale, with improvements in the shrine complex here, but also helping to re-establish something of a spatial organization of the city of Ajmer, a fortress in this location. And we see some of that same kind of angular contiguity between the Mughal project and the Sufi shrine. He took a different approach in Fatehpur Sikri, and it really was almost a radical approach, audacious approach, one might say, in the case of a Sufi saint of the Chishti order, Salim Chishti, who had been really instrumental in his blessings for the son who would be named after him, Salim, later Jahangir. And that saint's grave is actually enveloped within the great mosque at Fatehpur Sikri, shown here in detail plan on the left and the ground plane on the right. Even though a white marble exquisite structure, it's encompassed within the Mughal project, something that would not have been done, would not have been done at the shrines of the great peers. Akbar is succeeded by his son Jahangir, who has many spiritual concerns and affiliations, but some real mixed legacy of relations with the Sufis. He, of course, is named after the Sufi saint Salim, and he takes that seriously. He visits Sufi saints when he has problems and concerns. Frequently, they tell him, "Please, go away. You're bothering us." And so he wasn't always successful in his visits. And perhaps the kind of most sobering account came when he was visiting Mian Mir in Lahore. And we've now returned. This is a painting of Jahangir. It's sometimes titled Jahangir Preferring a Sufi Saint Over a European Kings. So this is the, and that is certainly, I think, what he would like to, and his, would like to think. But let's hear the story of Mian Mir's, the visit to Mian Mir in Lahore. He has come because he wants to move on a campaign to the Deccan and to take some of the Deccanese states that have been southern India that have proven so elusive. And he's kept waiting outside and is somewhat annoyed by that. A guard or kind of devotee of Mian Mir has kept him outside, and he's annoyed by that delay. And no one had ever delayed the emperor in his own kingdom. And yet, here's the passage. Yet he controlled his temper and composed himself and waited for permission. After a while, he was ushered into Mian Mir's presence. Unable to hide his wounded vanity, Jahangir, as soon as he entered, told Mian Mir in Persian, "On the doorstep of a fakir, there should be no sentry." Mian Mir, whose mind and soul were one with the Lord, caring little for the emperor's irritation, replied, "They are there so that the dogs of the world, selfish men, may not enter." It gets worse. So the emperor was ashamed, asked for forgiveness, and with folded hands he requested Mian Mir to pray for the success of his campaign. And this was a common supplication to the Sufi saints, which he intended to launch for the conquest of the Deccan. In the meanwhile, a poor man entered the gathering and bowed his head to Mian Mir and made the offering of a rupee before him. And the peer asked the devotee to pick up the rupee and give it to the poorest one. There, you can see where this is going to head. The neediest person in the audience, and the devotee went from one dervish to another, but none would accept the rupee. The devotee returned to Mian Mir with the rupee, saying, "Master, none of the dervishes will accept the rupee. None is in need, it seems." "Well, then go and give this rupee to him," said the fakir, pointing to Jahangir. "He's the poorest and the most needy of the lot. Not content with a big kingdom, he covets the kingdom of the Deccan. For that he has come all the way from Delhi to beg. His hunger is like the fire that burns all the more furiously with more wood. It has made him needy, greedy, and grim. Go give the rupee to him. Well, maybe it's not surprising that Jahangir and his family are buried on the far northwestern side at the furthest point of the city of Lahore as they could possibly be from Mian Mir. The next chapter, however, begins with a real re-engagement, and particularly with Mian Mir and his disciples. And these were two of the children of Shah Jahan, notably Dara, Shikoh, and Jahanara, both who Shah Jahan himself had instruction from a Sufi tutor and was, but to my knowledge, the Taj Mahal complex, I'm not aware, has an extraordinary Quranic epigraphy, and its design itself has, a mystical caliber. But I'm not aware of a Sufi shrine that's closely associated with the Taj Mahal complex, and would welcome any advice on that. But his children were, and in particular, we have Dara, Shikoh, and Jahanara becoming disciples of Mian Mir and studying with his principal follower, Mullah Shah Badakshi from Kashmir. And if we start to look spatially again at the relationship between the shrine of Mian Mir and the shrine that, or the pavilion that was set within originally a tank complex, a water tank, to the east of Mian Mir's complex that ultimately became the grave of Dara Shikoh's wife, Nadira Begum. They're right on axis. And this is one of the only cases of an axial relationship. I haven't done the kind of formal analysis to see if this is exactly 1/4 of the tank size, and but there will be a real formal set of spatial relations in this case too that link Mian Mir's tomb, that of his disciples, Mullah Shah and Khwaja Bihari, and then to the east, the Mughal complex of Nadira Begum. This is a tragic story because Dara Shikoh himself, in the War of Succession that begins with the illness of Shah Jahan, his sons start to battle with one another, and he's ordered executed by his own brother Aurangzeb. But even Aurangzeb, characterized as the orthodox and sometimes even the word bigoted is used in histories, particularly those written outside of some of the Indo-Islamic realm today in the West. Even Aurangzeb and his sister Jahanara, the sister also of Dara Shikoh, her grave is set immediately to the south of Nizamuddin Aulia's grave within that shrine complex in Delhi, and open to the sky, very simple grave with some small niche for planting of grass. And then similarly, her brother Aurangzeb ultimately in a small grave in this shrine in Kuldabad, likewise in a shrine, no monumentality, no dome, simple, and really constituting an unbelievable shift from monumentality to a diminutive scale, from the envelopment to being enveloped by the shrine, an extraordinary shift towards this end of the high period or classical period of the Mughal Empire. And it doesn't end there, and it's not limited to kings and queens, because if you go to many parts of Delhi and Lahore today and ask people, what's the significance of your place in the city of Lahore, they'll oftentimes tell you, well, there's a tunnel here. And the tunnel goes to the shrine of Data Sahib. The tunnel goes to Shalimar Garden. The tunnel goes from Shalimar Garden to the fort. The tunnel actually goes to Delhi. And 6 horses abreast could have ridden through it at that time. And there's all kinds of people very serious and saying, well, I haven't seen it. I mean, it's almost presented to you scientifically. I haven't seen it. I've gone into it a little bit, but there's some water and snakes, or my grandfather went into it, but I haven't seen it. I've heard about it. Very kind of elaborate. So I mapped these stories in Lahore, the case of Lahore, and it gives one an extraordinary portrait of the city and its intangible connections and proximity to places of importance, both Sufi and Mughal, from which one has a sense of identity, but also a sense of the kinds of blessings that would flow from those in authority, spiritual or temporal. So we kind of perhaps can return to this question of what kinds of landscape inquiry are relevant for the Indo-Islamic, Mughal-Sufi places of Southern Asia. And one idea that's on my mind is a term that has many meanings and that seem to resonate with different aspects of the themes that I've shared this evening, that of vilayat, sometimes translated as territory. It can be territory in a spatial sense or in a legal sense. It can mean the nearness to God. It can also mean foreign. So there's a type of tree, Vilayati kikar. Actually, it's our mesquite tree which is a foreign kikar tree in Delhi. You'll see it in many of the landscapes around Humayun's tomb area. So Vilayati can mean foreign, but it can also mean the territory and, again, friend of God, nearness to God, the sorts of associations that we've found in many of these places, the multiple associations that they would have. And as one thinks about the ways in which this traditions of gardens and space and landscapes and place are being conserved today in Delhi and Lahore, Lahore by groups like the Anjuman Mimran and ASI, Aga Khan Trust for Culture, Intact Delhi chapter in Delhi. On my mind is actually a particular place and figure to kind of test this hypothesis and idea, which is that very much in the vicinity of Humayun's tomb, and it's the person of Khan Kanan Abdurrahim, who was a great favorite of Annemarie Schimmel's. And she just said, the Khan Kanan was like, this is one of her great passions. He was a poet. He sponsored the painters who produced the great Ramayana, so Hindu epics. He was a Sanskritist as well as a Persianist. He was a person of many cultures and backgrounds. His tomb is here. It's said to have been stripped of its white marble for the construction of Saftardang's tomb in the 18th century, but if you read Khan Kanan's story, he gave away all of his wealth many times over and regained it again and gave it away. And if you were to kind of reflect on someone who might not have minded losing some of his wealth to others, this would be one of the examples of a person who comes to mind. Its location is very interesting in relationship to the places we've been discussing. Just to the southwest of Humayun's tomb, the southeast of the Nizamuddin Basti area, and along what was the original early stream that drained all of southern Delhi, now in Nala. The Barapula Bridge that I mentioned is located here. And I'm keen that we should kind of look at this place again today, because I gave really an upper view, but on the ground plane, there are lots of challenges. This Nala that passes through it needs an extraordinary amount of attention and concern. And the types of persons for whom the Khan Kanan and Nizamuddin were greatly concerned are living in informal settlements at the base of some of the piers and in the floodplains along the Nala. And yet it has this unbelievable, almost kind of World Heritage status. Indeed, Delhi is coming up as for consideration as a World Heritage city presently by virtue of places such as Humayun's tomb and its sultanate capitals in Shah Jahanabad and New Delhi and so many other of its magnificent places. And mightn't it be possible for this region and this natural system within the city of Delhi and similar types of places in Lahore to also be conserved in ways that would be as inspiring in the future as they have been at various periods of their past? That's the question, the thought that comes to mind, the possible vision that comes to mind when reflecting on some of the things that I've learned from Annemarie Schimmel, and I thank you very much for both coming and for